Great. Well, it is a pleasure to be here. Was not here last year, and I'm delighted to be able to attend this one. I think it's a testament to the field and its excitement that there's actually a related conference going on. I don't know if you're aware, called System X, with a different flair, but it's going on in the medical school, also in the idea of sensing and detection. So the fact that you have two of these conferences in the same day, I think, says there's just an incredible amount of activity here. So I'm going to tell you about some of our experience using wearables and what we're trying to do to see what we can learn and bring into this arena about health and its detection. But I first want to frame this in general terms, at least how we like to think about things. So we like to view health as a state, and that hopefully most of the time you are in the healthy state, but there will be times when you will not be healthy and you'll transition into a disease state. And it's obviously influenced by many things, your genome and then lots of other things. We like to collectively call your exposome, so the various exposures. And I would argue that this area is just starting to get under control. There's so much more to do, but I do believe we will be in a world where people will get their genome sequenced before they're born. But then here's an area that we're not so great at capturing. This, it seems to me, is where a lot of mHealth can really have enormous impact or potential. For being able to make all kinds of interesting measurements. And if nothing else, we should be able to detect some of the effects of these. Even if we can't detect them directly, we should be able to detect their effects, for example, pathogens, on health states. And so the ultimate goal will be to try and use all this information to be able to better manage people's health. So we've started a project, again, just to put this in context, a number of years ago, it's actually 7 years ago now, where we're trying to collect lots and lots of data about people while they're healthy and trying to understand in incredible detail what it means to be healthy and then what happens when people transition to disease states. So we actually do sequence people's DNA and then we measure actually their modified DNA. It's an area called epigenomics and epigenetics, and we measure all their RNA, most of it's out of blood, proteins as much as we can, cytokines. Their lipids and metabolites, we measure this both in blood and in urine. And so we're basically literally doing deep sampling on people and then making billions of measurements. You may have heard about the microbiome. That's a very exciting area that also manages people's health. And so again, we're trying to make these measurements when people are healthy, define their personal health state. It's all done at a personal level. And then understand what happens when they trigger into a disease state through a viral infection or other sorts of things. And so this is how the project started. And then about 3 years ago, a little bit more than that now, we started entering the world of biosensors. We certainly like this idea because you can make continuous measurements, as you heard already from David, and be able to collect data on a continuous basis and see what we might learn. What I liked about these is very complementary sets of data. This is more physiological measurements as we're measuring it. There are some biochemical ones. And then we can try and integrate it with these other sort of molecular measurements, again, to better define people's health state. So about 3 years ago, we decided to enter this space, and many of you may have entered before then, I'm not sure, but I remember in the summer of 2015, after we were in this, we just did a census, and there was something like 500 wearable or portable devices on the market that were measuring some health-related aspect or physiology. So it's a pretty daunting set of things. And certainly when we started, we basically started evaluating these both for accuracy. I wasn't going to talk a whole lot about that, but we can talk in the panel. But a big issue for us was just figuring out how to get access to the data as a researcher. We can sign people for these studies, but who would work with us to get us the data? And that actually wasn't so trivial. Now it's a little bit easier, but back then it's very hard to find someone who would work with us to get this. So anyway, we ultimately did settle on, we evaluated about 30 different devices, settled in on a few. Well, it's more than a few now. I guess I use 9 of these devices every day. I have 3 smartwatches right now, actually. And we do collect information. And a lot of the data I'll show you is actually from a Basis watch, which is interestingly no longer available. But anyway, so when we launched this project, again, we started measuring many things. There's a few additional things not on here, like continuous glucose and stress response. But we did use a number of these devices to make many measurements. I think you'll appreciate. You can obviously measure your activity, steps, biking, and so on. You can get some of that just from apps on your iPhone. But we also had things, virtually all the devices measure heart rate, We measure blood oxygen using several different devices, skin temperature, sleep, we think is very important, so on and so forth. Some of these things seem a little strange, like radiation. You might wonder, well, that turns out to be interesting on occasion too, as you'll, well, we can get into that later. But the bottom line is you can make all kinds of very interesting health-related measurements, and most of them do relay the information into your smartphone. So the first step was to try and define people's personal patterns, because the ultimate goal, as we see it, for defining health is to try and find deviations from people's baseline health state. So basically, we started collecting information, again, about people's patterns, and this happens to be my pattern. It's my sleep, heart rate, skin temperature, and not surprisingly, I sleep at night, and I'm awake during the day with an occasional nap in there. Here's my heart rate, low at night, higher during the day. Skin temperature, high at night. This is different from core temperature. Skin temperature high, low during the day, comes back up at night, and so on. So you can define people's personal baseline numbers. That's me. This is now the data from 45 people. Everybody, it turns out, has a different baseline resting heart rate, whether it's nighttime or daytime. They're a bit different. We all have personal baseline skin temperature differences, and we all have personal baseline oxygen differences as well. So everybody's different. And to me, this is one of the powers of these devices in that they are collecting data at a personal level. And then you can do things with these data. You can start grouping people into different patterns if you like. So this is some of the fun stuff you can consider. So this is grouping people into 4 types of pattern. I should point out that a lot of this work was done by Xiao Li, Jessie Dunn, who's giving a poster here, so you can learn more and speak with her later, and also Dennis Salins, as well as others. And so this is basically 4 activity patterns people tend to have. So this is one where people are generally constant during the day, so not very active at night, constant activity during the day, back down at night. So, even if you're not very active, you'd probably fall into this pattern. These are morning people, they spike in the morning. These are people who are active in the morning and afternoon, and these are people who are active morning, afternoon, evening, so on. So you can start grouping people by their baseline differences. No surprises there. Well, the key then for health, in my opinion, is to try and find deviations from your personal baseline. So as we started measuring more and more people, this is one of the things that came up. This is known already. It turns out on airline flights, if you go up in an airplane, this is altitude in green. This is one particular flight. Your altitude's there. Oxygen, your blood oxygen will actually drop. So it's here, it goes down. They pressurize airplanes at 8,000 feet. Your blood oxygen drops and comes back up. And by the way, there's an app on your iPhone that actually measures air pressure, and you can get that directly on these flights. We didn't have this at the time. Whoops, got ahead of ourselves. What wasn't so well documented, as far as I could tell, is how much and how often it drops. Well, it turns out, for me, it drops into 96% or below on about 70% of the time on flights. And about 5% of the time, it goes 90 or below, which is actually fairly low. Okay, so those happen to be my personal measurements. It turns out this is not just true for me. This is true for everybody, I guarantee. We've looked at lots of people and lots of different ethnic groups. If you go on an airplane and it goes above 30,000 feet, it's up there for any prolonged period of time, your oxygen will drop. So green is ground, blue is cruising altitude, and every single person, every single flight, your oxygen drops if it's high enough and it's long enough. Okay, so what wasn't necessarily known, as far as I could tell in the literature, is that when your oxygen drops, you get tired. It's correlated with tiredness. So for me, that number is 96, meaning you can do a blind test where you classify yourself as tired or alert and then look at your oxygen. And so this is on the ground, this is an airplane, but blue means I'm tired, red means I'm alert. 96 is roughly the threshold. So 96 or lower, tired, 96 or higher, I'm alert. We can do this more quantitatively. You can do reaction time tests, meaning you can see how quickly you respond to a visual cue. And this is percent oxygen, reaction time. Your response time gets slower as your oxygen drops. Okay, so the bottom line is on airline flights, you go up in an airplane, your oxygen drops, and it's very tightly correlated with being tired. Okay, I don't think that's so surprising, but it hasn't really been documented. So Next time you're on your airline flight and you're feeling tired, it's probably not because you've been working too hard. It's probably because the oxygen has dropped. Now, for those of you who are workaholics like me, that's very disappointing news, but there's hope. If the flight is long enough, you'll actually adapt. And so for me, that number is 7 hours. We've done this now quite a few times. This is one example here. So starts out, oxygen drops. I napped a little. It will drop low during a nap. But after 7 hours, pretty near every time, it will come back up. All right. So these are all to define personal baselines and what happens during very specific perturbations. Turns out airline flights is a very interesting perturbation. And you can find, then again, deviations from this. So to me, this is the power of finding unhealthy states. So on one particular flight, this is a personal example. I was flying to Norway, and it turns out my oxygen was much, much lower than usual. So I should preface this by saying I was in rural Massachusetts for 2 weeks, helping my brother put up fences where 55% of ticks are Lyme infested. And then 2 weeks later, I fly to Norway and fly to Frankfurt, and then from Frankfurt to Oslo. And on a short flight like that, that should be what my normal oxygen looks like based on many flights. And I measure myself all the time, so I know what it looks like. On this flight, the median and mean oxygen was 90. And when I landed, it did not come back to normal. Moreover, my heart rate was much higher. This is a 2-year pattern, but you can look at fraction of outlying measurements. This is heart rate, this is skin temperature. And there are many, many more outlying measurements of heart rate when I landed, and it was very obvious. And later I learned my skin temperature was elevated as well. You can see that down here. And so the bottom line is that turned out to be very valuable for me because, in fact, so I had these abnormal measurements. I then got a low-grade fever, went to a doctor in Norway who pulled my blood, said you have high monocytes, it's bacterial. I think you should take penicillin. And I said, no, I think I should take doxycycline, which is what you use for Lyme disease. It was very tense for a moment there, as you might imagine. And he actually did give in. I have my wife there as my witness, and she speaks Norwegian, so there was no miscommunication here. And the net result was, in fact, he gave me doxycycline, he gave in, and then when I came back, I gave blood, and sure enough, I was Lyme positive, and I have the perfect control. I was Lyme negative when I had left. I'd given a sample just before I left. So the bottom line is, these measurements, and this is a personal example, were actually very valuable for finding the first signs of detection. So the question is, how can this be generalized? And so we've actually looked at this now for every time I've gotten sick. What's nice about our cohort is we have lots and lots of measurements, including measurements of something called CRP, C-reactive protein, which is an indicator when you're ill. And so for the first 2 years while I was wearing these devices, we can pore over the data. And sure enough, there were 4 periods where I'd had outlying measurements of heart rate and skin temperature. One is the Lyme disease case. You can't miss that. Those values are so high off scale. Those are, as I say, they're unmissable in terms of the fraction of outlier measurement. So that's each day there. This is a day I had a cold. That's a day I had a cold. Those also give outlying measurements, and most days are right down in here. It turns out there was another day where I didn't report being sick, but actually had, that's this one here, high heart rate, high skin temperature. And then I went back and looked at the CRP, and in fact, that was elevated, just as high as when I had a viral infection. So the bottom line is every single time I have a high viral, I have high CRP, I actually have high heart rate and oxygen. And so you can detect this with wearables. And so we think it's actually more sensitive than perhaps your perception. So we've written algorithms to look at this more directly. There's a lot to do here. And this is what we're trying to do now, which is to try and find when people get sick at the very earliest possible times. And so for every one of those times I've gotten sick, in fact, we look for a change in heart rate over a defined period with a low false positive rate. And we can actually pick this up, we think, with fairly clear signatures. And you can pick up all 4 times of my illnesses. We had 4 illnesses on 3 other folks, and we can pick up theirs as well, each time normalizing to their personal baseline rate. So we actually think there is a lot of potential for these. This is all done relative to resting heart rates. Heart rates is better than skin temperature, it turns out. but there's more improvements to do. We also think, I won't have time to get into this, but we think you can also pick up elevated insulin resistance, which is a precursor to type 2 diabetes, with some of these sorts of measurements. One of those parameters is, in fact, altered heart rate as well, which tends to be up in those who are more insulin resistant. So where is all this going? Well, I think the ultimate goal of many of us is to try to make your smartphone your command center, if you will. Whoops. For this, there's a lot to do to be able to do this, to get this data integrated properly, and ultimately, I think, share it with the physician. This is the world I'd like to see us head towards, where with the genome sequence, we would add molecular information with wearable information to make things more anticipatory. These are some of the challenges ahead. I do think the devices are fairly accurate overall, but there are some that are not. That's something we talk about. I think it's a matter of defining which health events exactly we think we can detect with low false positives. I think that's a big deal. I think we will need to run proper trials to show the benefits. Nobody believes you unless you run proper trials. There's some level of regulation needed, and that's higher or lower depending on the particular devices and the particular applications. I think this is the hardest barrier that I see, which is getting physicians to adopt the concept. How many people are MDs here? Okay, well, I just probably insulted all of you. But anyway, it's open for discussion. And of course, I'm not so worried about this, but many people are, about data access and privacy. So I do want to say thanks to the folks in my lab who did the work, Xiao Li, Jesse Dunn, again, who has a poster, and Dennis. I've led the study, and I have wonderful other collaborators as well. Here's a shameless plug for a book I have that came out. You're welcome to read it. It even has a chapter on wearables. So do we take questions now, or do we do it the panel? How would you like to do this?
We have 2 microphones set up, and for questions, let's thank Michael for
okay.
As folks are approaching the microphone, maybe I'll start with the first question.
Sure.
Zach Cohaney always talks about the concept of the incidental element. How do you view the problem of not the sensitivity and your ability to detect something when you sort of know it's there, but all the times that there might have been an increased heart rate, and with so many things that you're detecting, how do you avoid sort of toxic false positive rates?
Yeah, I would say 2 things there. One is by adjusting the threshold. That is to say, I think the times when I had Lyme disease, those signals are so much stronger than my common cold ones. So you could deal with that by adjusting the threshold. Yeah, where you just increase the window where you demand either the number of outlying heart measurements to be higher or the intensity of those heart measurements. In both cases, they are higher, I believe, with the Lyme disease and the other. So that's one way to do it. The other is, quite frankly, I think it's going to be common sense. That is to say, if a scary movie gives you a high heart rate, well, you'll know that. You know, your light will go yellow, and you'll say, all right, well, it's a scary movie, no big deal. And where it becomes a bigger issue is when these devices go on someone else. So I think the biggest power of these devices is for like your kids or for taking care of the elderly. And then when the light goes yellow on my kid and I don't know where they're at, I worry they're getting sick and they're just watching some scary movie. I'll probably text them and they'll say, forget it, Dad, I'm watching a scary movie. So those are issues I guess we'll have to figure out. I don't want to be at the point where I'm seeing what they're seeing all the time. That's a little too invasive in privacy. But yeah, these are some of the issues. It's a good question, though.
Thanks for the talk. So we're trying to...
Wait, do you want to introduce yourself first for the audience?
I'm Donna Sprout-Metz. I'm from the University of Southern California, and I direct the USC mHealth Collaboratory.
Okay.
I would really like to move towards more sensitive and specific biomarkers that you're developing out. And right now, it's like everything's elevated, so maybe I have any one of these things. How do you see us moving closer to actually knowing what thing we have?
Knowing what? I missed the key word you said in there. Sorry, it's a little muffled
Okay,
up
sorry.
here.
So right now, you have a bunch of biomarkers and a bunch of signals.
Right.
And when X and Y are elevated, could be anything.
Yeah.
How do you think we're going to be able to move towards more
Yeah,
specific?
this is a really good question. I mean, from these kinds of measurements, we're only going to tell you have some sort of inflammatory disease, I think. I'm hopeful that the degree with which they show outliers reflects some level of the degree of severity. I mean, this is a basic inflammation response. I think as we move forward, we will have different kinds of internal signals, like I have a continuous glucose monitor on me now, and I know exactly what food does to what my glucose does, and I would like to see some level of that for certain kinds of other viral detections. I think some of that, I hate to say it's going to be easier to deal with in other ways. I envision a toilet sensor being a better way to possibly pick up pathogens and things like that. And so not a wearable per se, but still a very health-related device. So I think it would be very powerful to be able to know what pathogens people are acquiring when it happens. I do think other signatures will show themselves, like the insulin resistance. I think we'll be able to figure that by other ways, and I know there are contact lenses and ways of doing that sort of stuff too. But I think we'll figure this out in other ways, either by looking at certain parameters and signals, or by direct measurements of biomolecules. So I think both are possible.
So one vote for flushables, it sounds like.
Oh, yeah, and flushables will be powerful. Well, there is a very interesting concept, if I can add one more, take one more moment here. It's interesting, we have the technology now, you can tell when anyone gets a cold and what it is, but we never exercise that, right? You wait for it to go away. When it doesn't go away, then you figure out what it is, like, oh, it's mono, but by then they've infected, 100 other people. So if you think about it, we have it all backwards. We should be figuring out every single time what people have. So if they have mono, you quarantine them quickly. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine, but very interesting. My name is Ann Stevens, and I'm with a company called Plunkit Apps. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the logistics of the collection and the data reduction, because this is a lot of data, and the tools are pretty rudimentary.
Oh, they are very rudimentary.
Yeah.
We did started with the most obvious, which is we're only looking for deviations from basic. First of all, the data are available. You can download them, so you can play with them yourself. I know some groups are already doing this. Second is we made it easy. We said, let's just pick deviations from resting heart rate, either nighttime or daytime. And those signals, you can just look for, you can set windows and look for number of measurements that are deviations with certain false positive rates. When you have several years of data, you can set this we think pretty robustly for an individual person. I do think the more powerful measurements, though, will be when people are doing activities. Much like stress echo picks up heart defects when people exercise, and I think airline flights are going to be great for picking out people with pulmonary problems because you will see more severe reaction to those. I think that will be true for these devices as well. If we can pick up when people have deviations from, like when they're walking, they should have a higher heart rate, and if that's more standard deviations away, there's a bigger problem probably there. So I do think we need to tune them to activities, which will actually bring out bigger perturbations where there might be bigger health issues.
But just so a quick corollary to that, did you develop your own software to measure these deviations, or do you have a package you used?
No, we had to do all this from scratch,
That's what I thought. All
because it didn't exist.
Thank you very much, Michael.